You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a question from Emery in New Jersey. And interestingly enough, I actually have a client named Emery, so that made me think of her. But Emery in New Jersey is asking about the child-centered model and therapeutic objectives as far as goal setting. So really interesting. And Emery is a school-based child-centered play therapist. So school psychologist working in the school setting, and obviously the academic world is a little different than private practice where I am. So I'll read you parts of her question and then we'll dive into the objectives and goals and how it's best to handle that from a child-centered model. So her question is, child-centered play therapy has an emphasis on broadly defined therapeutic objectives rather than prescriptive goals. However, I work in a school setting where there's an emphasis on SMART goals for counseling. I'll unpack what SMART means in a second for those of you that don't know what that means. Do you have any suggestions for this or any examples of how you've used child-centered play therapy for a goal? You may be able to see a child is more regulated or has a better self-concept, but it's not necessarily measurable. Any tips or examples would be amazingly helpful. So Emery in New Jersey, thank you very much for your question. And let's talk through this. So let me begin by saying that this is something that I feel is really kind of a misguided issue. So Emery, I will answer your question, but let me get on a little bit of a soapbox for a second. So I personally have an issue with the fact that there is this pervasive belief that child-centered has what you said, Emery, to be broadly defined therapeutic objectives rather than goals. I think that's actually extremely false and inaccurate. And that's not a criticism of you, Emery. That's the pervasive belief in our field. And I would argue that child-centered has very clearly defined goals. There are 4 universal outcomes, which I will tease apart in a second. And it is very, very intentional with what we're working on and what parents are wanting to see, what teachers are wanting to see, and what objectives we have in mind for evidence that the child has worked through their issues. So while there is this kind of common perception that child-centered play therapy does not have goals, they are not prescriptive goals. I will agree with you on that. They are not prescriptive. But it's much more than just broadly defined objectives. So that was kind of my rant for the moment. And now I'll get back to answering the question. So when you're talking about SMART goals, for those of you listeners that may not understand what that is an acronym. So SMART capitalized, spelled out, SMART. And what SMART means is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So the intention with SMART goals, and this can be, they use this in business, they use this in all kinds of other industries. It's not specific to counseling. So when you are goal setting, when you have something you want to achieve, when you're working in a Fortune 500 company, they talk about SMART goals because it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So I am going to take my answer in a little bit of a different trajectory here, Emery. I believe that you can apply all of those 5 words to the child-centered model. I think there are very specific goals when you're working with a child in the child-centered approach. They are 100% measurable. They are absolutely achievable. They are relevant for every single child, and they are time-bound. Now, it may be different than other directive models or other more prescriptive orientations. So I'm not saying that they are universally defined the same way, but the child-centered model absolutely applies to all 5 of those criteria for setting goals. So let me unpack that a little bit. Specific goals for child-centered are usually the 4 universal outcomes. And I'll make sense of those in just a second. We've talked about them before, but some of you may be new, and so you may have no idea what the 4 universal outcomes of child-centered play therapy are. So we'll dive into those in a second. But you typically have those absolutely in specificity of what your goals are. And then you also set specific goals for every child. So if a child comes in with aggression or with dysregulation, obviously a specific goal would be reduction in aggression. And then if you needed it to be more specific, it would be an entire day where they do not demonstrate aggressive behavior, or an entire week, or whatever the time constraint would be. So it is absolutely feasible to set specific goals for child-centered. Measurable. You can quantify any goal that you set, even in a child-centered model. So like I just shared, if you have an aggressive child, measurable would be, okay, right now they are having outbursts at least 10 times a day. We want to reduce that to 5 times a day as the first level of goal. Then it would be, maybe only 1 time a day at some point, and then it would be very infrequently after that. That is also measurable and quantifiable. Is it achievable? So what is realistic and what can we expect? Can we expect a child to be perfect? Can we expect a child to never deal with earlier issues again? No, because why? We've talked about this before. When a child is at their best, they're able to implement their new skills, they're able to use their new tools, and they're able to change their behavior based on what they've acquired in therapy. That's when they're at their best. But it takes a lot of effort and work and intention and time and purpose and all kinds of things. But when they're not at their best, so let's say they're tired or they're hungry or they're stressed or they're emotional or they're bored or they're incapacitated in any other way, it is too hard to work so hard to implement what they've learned. So they will naturally default to old patterns of behavior. So we never expect a child to get to a point where they're never going to show earlier behavior patterns. They come and go. We just see a reduction in frequency. We see a reduction in severity. We see a reduction in intensity. So we absolutely see progress. So it's achievable that they will have these specific and measurable goals met. But we also have to be reasonable. We can't say, the child's not going to have meltdowns and tantrums anymore. Well, they probably will. But again, we have intensity, severity, and frequency reduced. So that is how we monitor that from an achievable standpoint. Relevant. Obviously, every child is going to have goals set specifically for them. So if we have a child who won't go upstairs without someone because they're scared of being upstairs alone, that overcoming of fear and reduction of fear and self-confidence and coping, those are all things relevant to that child, but they wouldn't necessarily be relevant to a child that is not dealing with fear or anxiety. So your relevancy is 100% contingent on what the child is dealing with, and therefore the goals align with that. And then time bound. So when you are looking at very short-term interventions, you may think like 6, 8, 10 weeks. Obviously, child-centered play therapy is not on that fast of a pace. But we can expect to see change in shorter windows than the duration of treatment as a whole. So we might say that by 10 weeks in, we want to see X amount of reduction. And then by 15 weeks in, we want to see further reduction. And then by 20 weeks, we want to see, almost resolution of whatever. So it can absolutely be time bound within the national average. So we're looking at 30 to 40 sessions as the national average to address all issues to a mostly complete extent. But that doesn't mean that by 10 weeks, we don't see positive change. Often we do. By 15, it's almost a guarantee you will have seen positive change. And then any point from 15 up, it's going to be more significant. So Emery, you specifically mentioned SMART goals. I think that the SMART system applies even to child-centered. And then let's dive into the 4 universal outcomes, because if you're not going to try to bend CCPT to work with the SMART, SMART framework, then you would absolutely use the 4 universal outcomes as your objectives and goals. So you said you may be able to see a child is more regulated or has a better self-concept, but it's not necessarily measurable. I think it absolutely is. I think if a child, for example, let's move forward with the better self-concept scenario. So when you are looking at the 4 universal outcomes, one of them is increased self-esteem. And with increased self-esteem comes a lot of increased self, right? So you have increased self-awareness, you have increased self-identity, you have increased self-worth, you have increased self-value, you have increased self-confidence. So there's a lot of selves that are tied into increased self-esteem. But broad category, one of the universal outcomes is increased self-esteem. So when a child has a better sense of self in all of those capacities, it is measurable. It is evident. So early on, a child will not try to do anything in the playroom. I can't do it. I need help. I don't know how. What's this for? And they give up and put it away. But the first time that they actually keep trying at something, not only do we document that as perseverance in our notes, but we also recognize that that is a measurable change. There's a better sense of self. There's a better sense of problem solving. There's a better sense of self-esteem because they're willing to keep trying. Then when they keep trying and they start having more positive self-dialogue, instead of saying, I can't do it, they say, oh, this is hard, but I'm going to figure it out. Well, now all of a sudden you have positive self-dialogue. So they believe in themselves, also measurable. And let's say they don't get frustrated and mad. Early on, most kids will put things away and they blame someone, something. They get frustrated, they get mad. Sometimes they throw things because they're so dysregulated, and any sense of failure is a reflection that they are a failure rather than I couldn't figure that out versus I'm a failure. Okay? So when all of a sudden the child just casually and calmly shrugs and puts something away, they're still giving up on it, but they're not frustrated and angry and feeling like a failure anymore. There's more of an acceptance of it. Also measurable. So I believe that you can document when a child is more regulated, when a child has a better self-concept. You have to note the changes that are taking place in play sessions. That's very clear to document. Early on, child did this. This many weeks in, child did this. Huge area of growth, huge shift, huge change. We document that, right? So that's one of the 4 universal outcomes is increased self-esteem. Another is increased regulation. We can absolutely prove that a child is regulating more in the playroom based on behavior. That's very clear and easy to note how the child is demonstrating more regulation. A third is increased worldview. So how does the child understand their actions and behaviors and words in context of everyone and everything else around them? So I can't just be me here and now in the moment with my emotions and do whatever I want. I learned that there is a consequence tied to that. There is impact. There is a ripple effect that comes when I choose to throw something or yell or have a meltdown or say mean things to people. You know, there's a response to that. So worldview grows. They learn empathy. They learn to put themselves in someone else's shoes. They learn that actions have consequences. That is also measurable. And then the fourth is increased emotional vocabulary. When a child starts to say, oh, I'm so annoyed, or I did it, I'm so excited, there is evidence of an emotional vocabulary. Not only are they accurately identifying their feelings, but they are also effectively communicating their feelings. So increase in emotional vocabulary is also measurable, also documentable. And you're able to say, child is using emotions in dialogue they're communicating, they're identifying, they're articulating. And early on, when a child shows you how they feel, they don't possess the vocabulary to tell you how they feel. So when they start telling you how they feel, that is very easy to recognize that that has increased for them as well. So, Emery, thank you so much for the question. I hope that's helpful for everyone, because I feel that we do get a lot of pressure, especially from insurance, managed care, third parties, that they want a very specific framework. They want a very specific way to show that we are doing effective therapy and that the model can work. And actually, a lot of times they don't support it, and they do not say that it works or that it is a billable modality. And it absolutely is. So, and even Emery, you being in a school, obviously that's a little bit of a different story, but you can very clearly demonstrate the efficacy and the effectiveness of CCPT through not only the SMART goal model, but also through the 4 universal outcomes. So hope that's very helpful. I wanted to let you know that since it is January, first week of January, right into the new year, this is our first week of 2024 together. And I was thinking about what this last year has been and all the work that we've done with kids and their families and the change and the healing that has taken place. And that's just been so encouraging to me. I have to share this story with you because this was honestly such an absolutely special moment. So last week, our office manager was sick. And so Eric, my husband, was filling in for her at the center. And he comes home and tells me this story. And I just have to share it with you because it is such an incredible testament to what we do and the impact that it has and how it matters so much. So first time for the family coming to a session. And so the little boy comes and he meets the therapist for the first time. And Eric reports that mom is very clearly anxious. Now, whether she didn't think he would want to play, didn't think he would want to go back, didn't think he would be on board with therapy, I don't know the details and the backstory, but Eric said that she seemed very nervous, very anxious. She was filling out intake paperwork, and it just seemed like it was kind of tense. And so Lauren finishes the session and brings the child out. Now, one of our first session procedures is that when we bring the child out to the lobby, after they've had their snack and after the session's over, we ask the child if they would like to come back and play again. And there's a lot of purpose in that. There's a lot of intention there. We want to give the child the control and the power to let us know what they think, because we don't want to make an assumption that they love coming and that they are just going to be forced to come every single week. So Lauren said, I wonder if you'd like to come back and play with me again next week. And Eric says that mom looks at the kid with this look like, oh no, what's he going to say? And he doesn't skip a beat and goes, yeah. And mom's face lights up and her eyes get big. And she has this like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that was his response kind of reaction. And Lauren goes, okay, well then I'll see you next week. I'm so excited. And Eric says, as they're walking out the door, mom does a little jump heel click, you know, like Wizard of Oz or whatever. You like walk and you jump and you click your heels together. So mom is so excited and so relieved that he had a good time and wants to come back, that she does a heel tap walking out the door. And obviously the little boy doesn't see her do this, but she's celebrating the victory of her kid loving coming to play therapy. And Lauren gave him the opportunity to have buy-in and to have ownership, and he has some power and control and he wants to come back. So what an incredible thing to witness a child come, experience the child-centered model, resonate with it, love it, feel loved and accepted and valued and cherished and delighted in, and all of those things, our be with attitudes, our reflective responses. Mom's a nervous wreck, not knowing what's happening in the playroom, not knowing how he's receiving this, not knowing what he's going to think. And then he comes out and is so excited, and that excitement passes on to her, and she's so excited. That is why this approach and this theoretical model is effective because we're not forcing anything. We don't have an agenda. We don't have directives. We don't have a prescribed outcome. It's meeting the child where they are and giving them space to be who they need to be. And who can't help but feel loved in that capacity? So, such a fun story. I was so happy to hear that when Eric came home and told me that story. And, imagine what that mom is going to say to her friends, to her husband, to her family members, as soon as she mentions taking her kid to therapy. That's a story she's going to tell. And that's so powerful. And it doesn't happen when a kid goes and sits on a couch and gets asked a whole bunch of questions and does worksheets and is told to do an activity where you stick cotton balls on paper and they all represent different things. Like, it's just not the same vibe. And I know that there's a time and a place for lots of different types of therapies. And I know that there are lots of people who are wholly bought into directive play therapy. So that's not a criticism on directive play therapy. It's just child-centered is special, and you get very, very amazing interactions and outcomes and responses through the child-centered approach. So be encouraged. New year, new opportunities to help kids, help their families, and to really pour in to the work that we're doing. And that's why you're here. So thank you for being a part of the Play Therapy podcast family. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. Happy New Year. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.